bread is at least 14,400 years old. That part's true, and it's provable. Farming is about 4,000 years younger, but there's a second claim about that exact same period spreading everywhere right now that isn't true. And I'm going to show you exactly where it falls apart using the actual published paper instead of repeating what everybody else is repeating. Every video about Bokashi, including my own, starts the history in the same place, Japan, 1982, with Dr. Higa. That's true, but it's not early enough. When my research partner, Sheikh Matsukawa, and I sat down to write the Bokashi master book, yet published or yet to be published, we made a deliberate choice not to start there in 1982. We went back to the actual beginning of humans, doing this on purpose, thousands of years before anyone in Japan or anyone else in the world understood what the word fermentation was. That history is stranger, older, and better documented than most people, including most Bokashi channels, realize. Right now, that history is also everywhere online, and not all of it is right. So this video is doing two things at once, telling that history and checking it as I go. By the end of this video, you'll know how old bread, beer, wine, and grain storage itself actually are, based on the real archaeological chemistry, not folklore. You'll hear about a live, unresolved argument among archaeologists that could rewrite why humans became farmers in the first place. And I'll show you an appealing story about that history that I checked against the actual published paper and couldn't verify, because catching that matters just as much as the parts that hold up. And you'll understand why when I say Dr. Higa didn't invent fermentation, I mean it as literal, dated, sourced, claimed, etc., not just as a nice line. Older than the farm. This is the fact that reframes everything else in this video. Humans were processing grain into something like bread before a single one of them had planted a crop on purpose. At a site called Shubaika 1 in northeastern Jordan, archaeologists excavating in a Natufian hunter-gatherer camp found charred remains in ancient fireplaces, dated to between roughly 14,600 and 11,600 years ago. When they analyzed those remains, they found flatbread-like food made from ground wild cereals, barley, einkorn, and oats, mixed with clubrush tubers, a starchy wild root. All of it gathered, not farmed. I want to be precise about what this does and doesn't show. This isn't evidence of fermentation specifically. There's no sign of yeast or leavening. It's evidence that humans were grinding, mixing, and cooking wild plants into bread-like food a full 4,000 years before anyone domesticated a crop on purpose. The researchers who published this, a team led by Amiel Arans Otaegui, even suggested something provocative, that the appeal of bread might have been part of what motivated people to start deliberately growing grain in the first place, rather than farming coming first and bread following. So that's claim one. Bread before farming is real, published, peer-reviewed, and it holds up completely. That's bread, genuinely old, but not yet fermentation. For the real fermentation story and a much stranger scientific argument, you have to go to a burial cave in Israel. The beer before bread argument. This is a live, published disagreement between archaeologists, and I think it's more interesting left unresolved than if I pretended one side had already won. At Rockefet Cave in Haifa, a team led by Liu examined stone mortars from Natufian burial sites, dated to about 13,000 years ago. Inside these mortars, they found starch granules and plant residues consistent with fermented beer like beverages, brewed, they argued, specifically for funerary feasts. Basically, drinks at funerals. That finding revived an old idea, first raised by archaeologists in the 1950s, that the desire for a reliable supply of fermented beer like drinks, not bread, might be what actually pushed early humans toward deliberately cultivating grain. Here's the part most content leaves out. Another archaeologist, David Item, published a direct rebuttal. His argument: those mortars were ordinary grain grinding tools, and any starch residue could reflect incidental fermentation rather than intentional brewing for a ritual. Liu's team published a formal response defending their original interpretation. As of this video, that argument is still open in the published literature. I'm not going to tell you it's settled because it isn't. Contested or not, that's still nearly 13,000 years ago. And it's not the last time this video runs into question about grain, moisture, and what happens when the seal on a stored food fails. About 2,000 years after the cave burial in the Jordan Valley, people built something that raises exactly that question again. And this is where the fact checking gets real. Learning to store before learning to farm. This is the section this whole video is actually built around. I checked a genuinely appealing story against the actual published research, and I want to walk you through exactly where it holds up and where it doesn't. At a site called Tra in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists Ian Cadwit and Bill Finlayson documented the remains of a small circular storage structure dated between roughly 11,300 and 11,175,000 years ago, the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, and still about 1,000 years before anyone in the region was cultivating fully domesticated crops. One of the best preserved structures used upright, notched stones to hold or suspend wooden floors above the ground. Engineering built for two specific things: air circulation underneath the stored grain and keeping it out of reach of rodents. Traces of silica from wild barley husks turned up inside. That's real. People were engineering dedicated, purpose-built architecture to manage a food surplus a full 1,000 years before there were, by any strict definition, farmers. Now here's the part I have to be straight with you about. The part that's actually all over the internet right now. I came across a claim repeated in a lot of places online that these granaries were built specifically to prevent fermentation, and that a moisture leak in a structure like this is what accidentally led early humans to discover beer. It's a genuinely compelling story, and I wanted it to be true. So I went and read the actual paper Quigit and Finlayson published in PNAS in 2009. It never makes that claim. It's about food storage and the slow shift towards agriculture. Full stop. It doesn't mention fermentation, brewing, or beer once. So here's exactly where the line is. These granaries proved people were engineering airflow and dryness around stored grain 1,000 years before farming existed. And that is mechanically the kind of setup where an accidental moisture leak would trigger wild fermentation if the seal ever failed. That's a reasonable thing to wonder about. But whether that's how anyone actually discovered beer isn't something I can point you to as far as a published source. And I'm not going to present it to you as settled fact, just because it makes a better story, no matter how many other videos are telling you that right now. The oldest wine we can prove. This one isn't a hypothesis, it's a chemical fingerprint found in 8 jars that changed the record books in 2017. And it has a companion discovery from 2026 that ties this whole video back to where it started. As two Neolithic village sites south of Tbilisi, Georgia, Getakui Gora and Shulaveris Gora, a research team led by Patrick McGovern analyzed residue inside large ceramic jars dated to between 6000 and 5000 BC. They found tartaric acid alongside malic, succinic, and citric acid, a specific chemical signature that, in this combination and concentration, points to one thing: grape wine. This pushed the confirmed record for wine back roughly 400 to 600 years earlier than the previous record holder, a site in Iran called Haji Firuz Tepe, where McGovern's own earlier research had found similar resin-treated wine residue dated to around 5400 to 5000 BC. I like including both of these not just because there's a winner, it's honesty. It's honestly a good demonstration of how archaeology actually works. Not one ancient origin point discovered once and settled forever, but a record that gets revised in public every time someone finds older chemistry. There's a coda to this that came out only recently. In 2026, a separate research team analyzing grain remains from those exact same two sites, Gadakril Gora and Shulaveris Gora, identified the earliest confirmed bread weight anywhere in the world. Triticum aestivum, dated to between about 5922 and 5747 BC, essentially the same window as the wine. They made the case using the physical shape of the wheat's rachis, the small stem segment at the head of the grain, which distinguishes true bred wheat from related species. And it lines up with older genetic research suggesting bread wheat itself arose from a natural hybridization between farmed wheat and wild grass. Agalops taushi in the exact region. Put simply, the same corner of the South Caucasus that gives us the oldest provable wine also gives us the oldest provable bread wheat. A real documented bread and wine cradle, and a nice bookend back to section 1. Wine wasn't alone. On the other side of the world, in a completely unconnected culture, people were doing something remarkably similar with beer and even earlier. Beer, independently, more than once. This is the detail that actually makes the case that fermentation isn't a single intervention that spread. It's something humans kept discovering on their own, in places that had no contact with each other at all. In Godin Tepe, Iran, residue analysis found calcium oxalate, sometimes called beer stone, a residue that forms specifically during barley beer production, dated to roughly 3500 to 3100 BC. It was found in vessels alongside actual barley grains. This is well accepted as the earliest chemically confirmed barley beer. Thousands of miles away at the Jiahu site in Henan, China, McGovern's team found something different, but just as remarkable. Residue from a mixed fermentation beverage combining rice, honey, and fruit, hawthorn or grape, dated to roughly 7000 BC. That's older than the Georgian wine finding, and it comes from an entirely separate cultural and agricultural tradition. Put those two together and with chapter 4's wine and chapter 2's contested beer, and a pattern starts to show up that I think is the actual point of this video. fermentation doesn't look like something that one culture figured out and everyone else copied. It looks like something humans kept arriving at independently over and over anywhere the raw ingredients and the right conditions existed, which raises the obvious question. I haven't actually answered it yet either. Why did this keep happening? What was fermentation actually doing for these people biologically? And what made it worth the investment again and again? Strip away the ritual and archaeology for a second. And the reason this kept getting reinvented is straightforwardly biological. Fermentation does three things to food all at once, all driven by microorganisms, mostly yeast and lactic acid bacteria, the same groups that I've talked about on this channel before. It preserves food that would otherwise spoil by producing alcohol or acid that outcompetes organisms that would cause it to rot. It makes some nutrients more available. Fermentation can break down compounds humans can't otherwise digest efficiently. And it changes flavor and texture in ways that made stored food more appealing, not just more survivable. None of that required anyone to understand microbiology. It required noticing that grain left wet in the right conditions turned into something better, not worse. And then doing it again on purpose. That's the process. That's the entire mechanism behind every site in this video. From a Jordanian granary to a Chinese Neolithic village, repeatable results long before anyone had a name for what was causing them, which is exactly the same starting point Shig and I found ourselves at several thousand years later, writing a book about a Japanese product that didn't exist until 1982. A practice, not an invention. This is the part of the story that's mine and Shig's specifically, the decision that shaped how we wrote the whole book. When Shig Matsukawa and I set out to write the book, or the Bokashi Master Book, still doesn't have a real title, we made a deliberate structural choice early on. The book's history would not start with Dr. Higa. We'd start with fermentation itself. As a human practice, going back as far as the evidence would actually take us, which turned out to be the research behind everything in this video. That choice wasn't just an academic preference. Writing that chapter accurately meant treating the archaeology with the same evidence standard I use everywhere else on this channel. Real dated sites, real published chemistry, real disagreements reported honestly instead of smoothed over, and appealing claims checked against the primary source instead of repeated because they sounded good, which is exactly the kind of technical writing I still do professionally. I do it for clients who need something explained accurately rather than persuasively. What all of the research led to is a single, simple, and completely defensible thesis. Dr. Higa didn't create fermentation. He built on top of what thousands of years of human history had already led to. The same bread, beer, wine, and grain storage you just heard about arrived at again and again in cultures that never spoke to each other for exactly the same biological reasons. And that reframes something I said in the very first video on this channel in a way I want to make explicit. Why the order matters. In the first video, I told you microbes built the atmosphere you're breathing over billions of years, long before anything you'd recognize as a plant or an animal even existed. This video covers a much shorter span, 14,000 years instead of billions, but it's the same pattern. One more time. The thing that looks new and modern, whether it's oxygen in the air or a product on the shelf, it's almost never actually new. It's built on something much older that most people never hear about. Bokashi and EM are a real, specific, genuinely useful modern formalization of something humans already had been doing independently on every inhabited continent for thousands of years before Okinawa in 1982. Knowing that doesn't make the modern version less useful, it makes it more honest. And honest is the only version in this story I'm interested in telling, which is exactly why the next video in this series goes back to the modern formalization itself. What's actually inside EM and what each piece of it does. Okay, so we have the 3 microbes that actually make Bokashi work. That's going to be our next video. That same standard, real sources, real dates, disagreements reported honestly instead of smoothed over, appealing claims checked before they're repeated, is also what I do professionally today. Independent, evidence-based evaluation of biological treatment systems, technologies, and odor problems for municipalities, engineering firms, and manufacturers with no vendor affiliation attached to the answer. If that's relevant to your organization, you can find me at my website, ericglancaster.com. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time.